Hi everyone, I'm guessing you're probably familiar with the Appeal to Aetius if you're watching this channel, but in case you're not, the Appeal to Aetius was a letter sent by the Britons to a certain Roman called Agitius. Now this is recorded by Gildas. In his description of Britain after the end of the Roman era, he explains that Britain was being attacked by Picts and Scots, so the Britons needed help, so they sent an appeal to this man Agitius. And the letter, quoted by Gildas, refers to Agitius as thrice consul. So supposedly this recipient of this letter, Agitius, had been consul for 3 times, at least 3 times by the time this letter was sent. And so because of these reasons, because of the name Agitius and this detail about being thrice consul, it's pretty much universally accepted that the recipient of this letter was a man called Aetius. He was a very powerful, very important, influential Roman leader active in Gaul, so not far from Britain, in the 5th century. And he was consul for the 3rd time in 446. So if this letter was sent after he was consul for the 3rd time, hence why he's called thrice consul, that means the letter must have been sent after 446, but he died in the 450s, so that places the sending of this letter to somewhere around roughly 450, which is actually where the traditional date of the Anglo-Saxon invasion comes from, because after this letter was sent, Gildas explains that because there wasn't any favourable response, the Britons had to turn to the Germanic mercenaries to help them. And so the traditional date for the Anglo-Saxon arrival is 449 for that reason, based on the dating of this letter, which itself is based on the identification of the recipient Agitius as Aetius. However, this identification, I believe, and certain other scholars believe, is not very secure. So there are a few reasons. For one, it's true that Aetius is the only person who is known to have been consul for 3 times in the 5th century. In fact, the only person within, I think, a 300-year period who was consul 3 times, not including emperors. But although it's true that he's the only person who's known to fit that criteria, that doesn't mean he's necessarily the only person who actually was consul 3 times. You see, there was such a thing as a suffect consul, and that was a consul who became a consul just for the remaining part of the year if the original consul for that year had died or resigned. But these suffect consuls are generally not recorded. When we see these consular lists, they record the proper consuls, the ones who were designated at the beginning of the year, not the suffect consuls. So there could have been many, many, many more people who were consuls that we just don't know about. And then, as well as that, there's the fact that there were also independent consulaships that were established outside the empire. For example, when Carausius, the usurper, became emperor of Britain and Gaul, independent of the rest of the Roman Empire, he set up his own consulship with its own consuls, independent of those in Rome. So we don't have a list of those consuls, and so outside the Roman Empire, as it started to collapse in the 5th century, there could have been other consuls, other entire consulship arrangements that we just don't have any records for. So there's no guarantee that just because Aetius is the only person who we know about who was consul for 3 times in the 5th century, that doesn't mean he was the only person in the 5th century who actually was. There could have been many, many more people who fit that criteria. In addition, the use of the word thrice consul does not necessarily mean that he was consul for 3 times. You see, it's true that the word thrice obviously has a numerical meaning, but it can also be used in a qualitative way. For example, there was a god, Hermes, who was sometimes known as Hermes thrice great. It doesn't mean that he became great 3 times. It's a word that's used to emphasize a quality. And also in Virgil's Aeneid, there's a bit where Aeneas is referred to as thrice happy. So the use of the word thrice doesn't just have a numerical meaning, it also has a qualitative meaning, a way of emphasizing a quality. So when Gildas refers to Agitius as thrice consul, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was saying he was consul 3 times. He could have just been emphasizing the quality of him as a consul. In other words, it could have just been a compliment, in which case it would be much easier for someone to fit the criteria of Agitius thrice consul. And in addition to this, there were various people who were active in Gaul and that kind of area during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, whose full names we don't know. There are some people who are recorded with only one of their names, so we don't know if maybe there were other people, as well as Aetius, the Flavius Aetius, the famous one, who may have also had the name Aetius or something even closer to Agitius. We just don't know. So it's true that as it stands, if you take in isolation the appeal to Agitius, then Flavius Aetius is the best candidate. But he's by no means the only possible candidate. There are various ways in which it could have been referring to someone else entirely. And so when we take all this information in conjunction with the very clear evidence from archaeology and from the Gallic Chronicle of 452, it's clear that the Anglo-Saxons had arrived and had settled a large portion of Britain way before the third consulship of Aetius. So either Gildas's reference to this letter is misplaced entirely. Perhaps it was actually an appeal concerning the attacks of the Anglo-Saxons themselves, rather than being about the barbarian attacks from before the Anglo-Saxons arrived. So either that's the case and the letter is totally misplaced in Gildas's chronological framework, or it wasn't sent to Flavius Aetius. It was sent to someone else entirely, much earlier, and otherwise unrecorded consul, or someone who is recorded as consul, but only once and thrice in Gildas's work is just used as a qualitative way. It could be someone who had the name Aetius or Agitius, who just isn't recorded as having that name because we don't have their full name in the available records. There are all sorts of possibilities, but one of those 2 options must be true. Either the letter is misplaced, or it wasn't sent to Flavius Aetius.